Both Russia and the West misunderstand the West, and the West forgets its spiritual roots, and Russia sees trickery in Western honesty. So, why is this happening? Well, because of one ancient idea, and that is the logos, the logos from Greek, the word, which it literally stands for, the word. So, what exactly is the logos? Well, the Greek roots, logos, stand for word, for reason, for order, right? And in the Judeo-Christian sense of that word, it kind of ties itself to the Bible, where in the beginning was the word. In the Judeo-Christian sense, this basically shaped Western language, science, and even concepts such as democracy itself. Uh, it stems from the ancient Greek culture. And the word logos itself is sacred because it means truth, it means rationality, it stands for honesty. There's this misconception that's taking place in the West because the word logos caused rationality within the Western man, right? So you can see that since this stems from a religious background, in relation to the Bible, the Judeo-Christian interpretation of the word logos is seen as the word, meaning the word of God, right? Meaning the Bible, which the Bible is often called the word of God. What I'm trying to say here is that it emerged from these religious roots, right? But we cut off these religious roots that the word was based on. The Western man today, you can even see it is ultimately rational. He's consumerist. Uh, you can see in the recent past there were a lot of ideologies like communism, like Nazism, like all sorts of these geopolitical and these political movements, these mass movements that happened in the West are shaped by the word logos, right? The entire culture of the West is shaped by the word logos. Now, since I mentioned that the Western man is in essence rationalistic, right, consumerist, especially in today's age, and individualistic, now it's important that you don't confuse being individualistic with Jung's idea of individuation. It doesn't have the same meaning to it as individuation. Being individualistic is spiritually hollow, right? It's an in its essence, it's a consumerist. It's a consumerist word. It doesn't originate from a spiritual background. And this is not to criticize anything, okay? I'm just trying to interpret. What I'd like to make clear is that I'm just trying to interpret a religion here, okay? I'm I know that religion is something that is deeply sacred and deeply intimate to the individual. So the way you perceive and interpret religion, I'm not saying it's the wrong way, it's your way, and that means that it's the right way because it's the right way for you. What's right for me might not be right for you, and that's the bottom line that I'm trying to set here. I'm just trying to make an observation. So bear with me, please. What I'm trying to get at is Putin's shadow. Uh, this ties itself into how Russia misunderstands the West. Um, and you can see it in Putin's background that he has a KGB background, right? There is a fundamental distrust and deception and manipulation. And that's also what you can see in the Russian propaganda, right? Now, when I say Russian propaganda, that doesn't mean that there is no Western propaganda. There is Western propaganda, yes. These points are valid, but I'm just trying to observe Russian propaganda itself right now, okay? So the way Putin is approaching the entire concept of propaganda is from a much more deceptive and manipulative way as compared to the West. There's also a factor of his criminal worldview. in this. People are always hiding their motives, right? Especially politicians. And the Russians unconsciously were projecting onto Putin, and that's also what kind of allowed himself to stay in power, because the Russian mind is in a way the Eastern mind, and the Eastern mind is not as married to the concept of the logos as the West is. So that also shows that there's this irrationality in the Russian mind because it's not as married to the word logos as the West is. And that's not a wrong thing, it's just a different way of seeing the world as compared to the West. And there is a paradox in the Western world because the word logos, it comes from ancient Greek, and the word logos, the Bible was translated from ancient Greek, right? And the word logos ties itself to what I mentioned, the word of God, because the Bible was translated from ancient Greek, and the Bible stands for the Word of God. It is the Logos that was the foundation of the Western Judeo Christian world. And the paradox that I'm trying to point out is that the Western religion comes from the very basis of that word Logos, but it's it the problem is that the Logos, the Word of God, it became literal. It's not supposed to be literal because religion is ultimately, in a way, an irrational experience, an irrational human experience. So because it comes from the Logos in the West, the Westerners interpret the Word of God literally, right? And that actually cuts off, right? If you take a look at the basis, the Bible and Logos, it actually cuts off uh, that connection, right, between those two things. And what that causes is too much emphasis on rationality. And you can see the impact of that in today's world, where they tend to be atheist, right? I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. I'm just observing here. And if you take these things sort of into account, it kind of shows you like if you take the logos, the West, the Judeo-Christian uh, essence that shaped the West, right? If you take it into account and then you compare it to the Eastern, in this case the Russian, irrational point of view, which is in a way sort of more tied to. I'm really struggling here to express myself because what I need you to understand here is that it's very difficult for me to express myself. It also ties itself into my psychological type. I tend to be the irrational introvert, so I essentially see the world from in a certain way, but it's very difficult for me to use the logos, right? To use the word and verbalize how I perceive the world. Now, the point that I was trying to make is that uh, if you take into account Putin's shadow, he basically, in a way, lived out his shadow because of the KGB background and because of the criminal background uh, in St. Petersburg, right? Where he was involved in criminal business. And because he lived out his shadow, his light is unconscious, right? That means that these criminals, this is not a generalization, but at times because they lived out their shadow, they sometimes, okay, this is not the case for Putin. I want to uh, emphasize that. Okay, this is just an observation because it ties itself into society. My observation, the complexity of the entire criminal world, where criminals sometimes can, even though they do bad things, can fundamentally be good people, right? That is why we have the anti-hero, why we that is why we identify with the entire archetype of the anti-hero, much more on a deeper level than with a simply just a good guy, right? Like Superman type of hero. So this, what I mentioned, really influences the mindset that makes Putin distrust this genuine logos, right? The Western logos, the rationality. So what I was trying to say is that criminals live out their shadow. It's that they don't repress the dark parts like we do. They are aware of their evil, and while normal society hides behind masks of virtue, these criminals live out this bad side of them, right? So this Eastern misunderstanding, Russian misunderstanding of the West, and the Western misunderstanding of itself, and also, in a way, Russia, um, ties itself to the diplomatic misunderstandings that emerged from this entire idea. Basically, what I'm trying to say is that the American presidents, like Bill Clinton, up until now, what I'm trying to say is that American presidents often mean what they say, at least even symbolically, right? So when Putin was having diplomatic meetings with presidents like Bill Clinton, George Bush, etc., he doesn't really believe them because if the situation was reversed, right? If Putin was the American president and Bill Clinton, say, was the Russian president, Putin wouldn't trust him, right? This is the logos versus the shadow in a way. It's they're just talking past each other. There is a rational way to look at it as well, in the way that it ties itself to the Russian history, where there is a fundamental mistrust that built itself up. I could actually see it even in the comment section in my previous videos, where some Russian individuals, they expressed their distrust to their government. They don't even trust their government because of what has happened historically, right? They don't even trust anyone. And this also ties itself to the communist regime and how it operated, the terror, the propaganda, and the fear that it created within the Russian mind, within the Soviet mind, and ultimately within the individual that experienced that, right? You do not even have to experience that. It's just something that can be passed on to you from your parents, from your grandparents, right? It's something that lives within you because it's been a part of your culture for such a long time. So that would explain the diplomatic misunderstandings that happened and the mischievous and manipulative way that Putin was approaching them. And this would sort of conclude that the tragedy is that they're essentially misreading each other, they're misunderstanding each other, right? This is, if you take a look at a simple example, let's say you have a spouse, you have a son, you have a friend, a person whom you talk to, and once there's a misunderstanding, it can create conflict, and there can be a tendency to try not to resolve the conflict, and one person can get upset at the other, and this sort of prohibits it. It stops. Uh, if I were to put it in a romantic way, it stops love from flowing between these two individuals. They become upset, offended, and they refuse to talk, right? They turn away from each other. And that is why these wars also happen. What's happening on the mass scale can also be observed in the individual's life, in your life, in my life, right? These are problems that we are facing even on the local level. That's why the local level, the individual's level, is so important. Because if you address the local level, you have at least some chance of trying to resolve the mass, uh, the grand scale of things, right? So if the individual individuates, he will be able to fundamentally have a better life in a way, a better life experience. And that creates a sort of harmony and this can transfer itself onto others. And this also happens in these political settings where politicians talk to each other. Because if you strip everything down, you ignore every single aspect, which I'm not saying that is irrelevant, okay? Everything is important. Even economy is important, which in my previous videos I mentioned that the economy doesn't really matter. It does. Of course it does. But I was trying to point out that the psychological aspect is fundamentally what creates humans, what is human. That's who we are. So that's where the answer lies. So the conclusion would be that the West is sort of slowly forgetting the Logos, right? Since it cut off the relation of the Logos from the Bible, from religion, it sabotages itself. And the religion of the West itself shapes out to be paradoxically the ultimate demise of the West. And to begin with, Russia never trusted the West because uh, of what I outlined. That doesn't mean that the trust can't be rebuilt. It just means that the entire situation is much more complex than you might think. And true communication, in a way, what I'm trying to say, can't happen unless both understand the roots of their worldview, right? Who they are. Because as I mentioned, Russia is dealing with an identity crisis. The West is also dealing with an identity crisis. What's currently taking place in the US also ties itself into a sort of struggle for identity. These corporations in America, this ultra capitalistic environment that it operated in for such a long time, it poisoned America, right? And Elon Musk, many people now tend to project on figures such as Elon Musk because they say he's the embodiment of evil, he's a Nazi. Well, I'm not here to talk about whether that's true or not. I'm just here to say that he's not the reason, he's the symptom of a much bigger problem, okay? A human problem is what I'm trying to say. So you can see that the solution is not simple, but understanding the difference is at least the first step. It means that you're becoming conscious of the unconscious. You're building up an awareness of the entire situation. And that's the first step towards individuation. That doesn't mean that this issue is going to be resolved within, I don't know, decades, centuries, or maybe even millennia. It means that slowly but surely, if individuation is underlined within societies, now it's a very complicated concept. Okay, it's not as simple as just individuation, becoming an individual. It's a very complex and very subjective thing. Okay, what it means to individuate for someone else doesn't have to necessarily mean to individuate for you. But Jung tried to build this framework from which you can actually approach this and understand it. He basically sticked these labels on these things which were happening in the world, and he was just trying to observe them and trying to label them so that we would be able to at least get some understanding of what's going on. That was the sort of the point that I was trying to get at. I hope that it kind of makes sense.